Welcome back to Z-Speed and thanks for tuning back in. Today I'm going to show you how to remove your automatic transmission and swap it out with a 6-speed manual transmission. So if you're interested in something like that, just stay tuned. Okay, before we get started, this is part one of a 3-part series on the transmission swap. Just in case you were wondering, it's going to be a little easier to break it up into 3 parts. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that you can get your 350Z up high enough to get your old transmission out and your new or used transmission back under the car and up into the car. So you can see to the left of my new transmission I've got right here, I've got 2 jack stands, and I had the smaller ones already, and I went out and purchased a larger jack stand. So make sure you got a jack stand that's big enough to actually get your car high enough up. Now I'm going to use the smaller jack stands in the rear and these bigger ones in the front, because the rear of the car does not have to be as high as the front. The front has to be high enough to slide the transmission out. So this is works for me, and I was able to get it out no problem. So if you don't have a lift, like I don't have a lift, you could use jack stands, no problem. You just have to make sure that they're big enough to allow you to remove the transmission and put the new one in. So I'm also going to be using a transmission floor jack here. You can see that right there. And I'm going to be bringing the transmission down out of the car on this jack, but the height of these two combined, the transmission on top of this floor jack, is going to be too much, and I'll have to actually slide the transmission off of this jack or this floor jack and onto a piece of cardboard just to get it out from underneath the car. That's just one of the problems without having a lift that you'll run into, but I was able to do it. So hopefully if I was able to do it, you'll be able to do it. So make sure you have a plan on how to get your old transmission out and your new transmission into your 350Z. Now, before we jack our car up and put it on jack stands, we do need to break a couple bolts loose on top of the transmission. I'm going to show you on this new one right here. These 2 bolts right here, we need to break these bolts loose first, because it'll be a lot easier to do while the car's still on the ground versus being up on those jack stands. So it wasn't too bad at all. I used what are called mountain wrenches, but you can still use your traditional sockets or like an automotive socket set. But I just wanted to show you these mountain wrenches really quickly before we get started, because these things really come in handy. You can buy these on Amazon. I'll put a link below, but these things really get in some really tight places. They have a little bit of a swivel to them on the head, and I was able to use these ratchets on all kinds of bolts in here, and it did make life a little bit easier. If you haven't picked up a set of these wrenches, think about that. It might make it a little bit easier to get to those hard to reach bolts on this transmission swap. Now I'm going to give you an engine bay perspective on these 17mm bolts here. This is the driver's side bolt right here. So you got a pretty clear access there, and I was able to get my mountain wrench in there and break that free, no problem. But the passenger side bolt was a little bit more difficult. You can see there's a wiring harness right here and a couple brackets that we're going to need to remove. So that's going to be a little more difficult, but I'm definitely going to show you how to do that. It's not too bad, but go ahead and break the other bolt loose first. So now that we've removed the transmission bolt from the driver's side, we can focus on the passenger side bolt here. You can see I've removed this vacuum tube right here to give me a little better access to get down here to this wiring harness area. And this wiring harness is attached to a little bracket that's attached to the back of the cooling system here. I'm going to move this out of the way here. Right here, you can see that this little bracket's held on by 2 10mm bolts, and we need to release those 2 10mm bolts that is attached to the back of the cooling system, so we'll have better access to that 17mm bolt. We also have a 10mm bolt holding this dipstick on. We need to remove that so we can move that dipstick around a little bit better and get our wrench in there, so we'll have a little room to actually have a little throw on the wrench and back that bolt out. Now, if those 2 bolts were removed, we can go ahead and use our jack stands in the front of the vehicle. Now, I maxed out my floor jack and got as high as I could. Now I'm going to switch to the back. I'm going to go ahead and slowly go up. Just take your time. Make sure that everything's nice and safe. If you have a buddy hanging around, he might be able to watch the car, make sure it's not going to move while you lift the rear up. I got mine up in the rear, no problems at all with anything shifting. And now I'm going to switch back to the front of the car, and I want to show you a little trick that I use to get my car up even higher so it would accommodate the removal of the transmission. Okay, so this is the trick that I use to get my car up even higher because I had maxed it out already and it wasn't high enough. And I use these 2 blocks of wood here. You want to make sure you've got nice new solid blocks of wood here. You don't want to be using anything that's old or possibly rotten because the weight of the car could crush the wood or make it snap in half, and that's the last thing you want while you're trying to jack your car up. So you can see that I've got 2 new blocks of wood here, and you can see how I've positioned them under my floor jack away from the wheels, and that made everything nice and stable. Then I was able to go ahead and get it up high enough to get the jack stands just perfect so I could actually get the height I needed to remove the old transmission and then insert my new transmission. So this is how I did it. There's probably some other tricks, but this is what I did to get it up high enough. So now that we've got the car up high enough to get the transmission in and out, we can go ahead and drain the automatic transmission fluid. You want to get all the fluid out. It's just going to make things a lot easier when we go to drop the transmission. It'll be just a little bit lighter. Plus, there's a possibility that you can spill transmission fluid out the back of the transmission where the drive shaft hooks up. So make sure you go ahead and drain all the fluid out right now. Okay, one other thing I didn't mention earlier is that I went ahead and disconnected the negative battery cable at this time because we're going to be disconnecting quite a few different sensors as well as the transmission harness itself, and you definitely don't want the computer to see that. Of course, we're going to have some codes at the end of this job and we'll go over that later, but you don't want the car to see all these sensors being disconnected, so go ahead and disconnect the battery at this point. Okay, now we can go ahead and start draining the transmission fluid at this time, and it's pretty straightforward. There's a little bolt right there. Unscrew it and let her drain. And then next up, we're going to be removing the exhaust system. Now you can get away with removing it from the cat back. I've got some Motordyne ART pipes here, as you can see, or you might have straight pipes. But at this point, I'm going to recommend that you remove everything from the header back. Now, I actually left these Motordyne ART pipes on while I was removing the transmission, but after I got finished, I realized it would have been so much easier and I would have had so much more working room to get to the bolts and the transmission lines and everything that's connected to the transmission if I would have just removed these Motordyne ART pipes. So I'm sure the same thing will happen with the catalytic converters. If you're just running catalytic converters, you'll just have a lot less room to work with. So it's just 3 bolts. Why not go ahead and remove your catalytic converters or your straight pipes or your ART pipes or wherever you're running, and that'll just give you a lot more room to get in here and get to everything you need to. Now you can see right here, I'm removing this little Y support here that hooks up to your Motordyne ART pipes in my case, but it could be your catalytic converters if you're running those. You want to go ahead and remove that and get that out of the way because that's going to be in the way when we drop the transmission. Now next up, we can disconnect the right and left O2 sensor that's connected to your catalytic converter or your aftermarket test pipes, wherever you're running. And there's a little tab up top that you need to press down and to get it to disconnect. And I'm having a little bit of trouble getting it to disconnect, but eventually I got them removed. So I'm not going to show you the removal of the exhaust system because everybody's exhaust system may be a little bit different. And we're going to move on to after that's been removed and what's up next. Okay, now that your exhaust is removed, we have a little brace that goes right across the drive shaft that we need to remove so we can drop that drive shaft out. And you see that cord that's attached to the brace? You won't have that in your car. That is a O2 sensor that's attached to my air fuel ratio gauge that I installed. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it below, but you won't have this cord right here. So I'm going to cut that loose from this little brace here, but this 10, a 10, a 12 right here on both sides. And it's really easy to remove that little bracket. That little bracket just, I guess, it helps keep the drive shaft up there if it were to come loose. I'm not sure exactly why that little tiny brace is there. It's not very strong. So get that out of the way and we can move forward. Now, before we drop the drive shaft, I want to show you a couple things I've disconnected from the transmission. This little bracket that holds the O2 sensors to the catalytic converters, I dropped that off of the transmission. It's just like a 12 mil bolt that holds that on. Then I disconnected the crankshaft position sensor right there. If you want to remove that, it's just a 10 mil bolt holding that in. You'll need to remove that before we drop the transmission. So go ahead and remove that. And then up here by the transmission, to the cabin is this little linkage that actually allows you to shift forward, reverse, drive. I released that with just a little clip. It came out really easy. Now we're ready to remove the transmission drive shaft. Okay, it was just 4 nut and bolts holding this drive shaft to the differential. You can see I just pulled the last bolt out, and now I'm going to slide the drive shaft out. So just lower it down just a little bit to get it around the differential right here. You can see I'm going to get it into a good spot right here. And now you're going to pull straight back on the drive shaft, and it'll actually just slide right out of the transmission. It was really simple. I was pretty amazed that it was so easy. And once you pull it out of the transmission, just be careful not to scratch it up on anything. This carbon fiber, it can actually scratch pretty easily. You don't want to scratch it on that metal brace that's right there. So just slide it out nice and easy, keep it in good condition. You can resell that on eBay if you want and make some money from that. But yeah, mine came out really easily. Now, before we move forward, I want to show you something really quickly on the drive shaft. See this little mark right here? There's an actual mark on the differential as well. And those two need to be lined up. So when we put our new drive shaft in, it has a mark on there as well. And we have to line that up with the mark on the differential. But I'll show you that when we reinstall it. Now that we've cleared most of the obstacles in our way of the transmission removal, we can go ahead and start prepping the transmission for removal. Now this little window right here that sits at the bottom of the transmission, you can see it's held on by a 10 mil bolt, and I used a 1/4 inch ratchet to actually gain access in there to remove it. We'll need to remove that little window from the bottom of the transmission so we can gain access to the torque converter bolts. You can see the major problem is that this little subframe to the suspension here is in our way, and we're going to kind of work around that. You can see here's the rack and pinion steering, and above that's the actual starter. Just to give you reference where we're at. We're at the very bottom of the transmission. Now you can see I've removed the plate, and now we have access to the torque converter bolts. And yes, it's very tight in here, and we have to work from the side, either the driver's side or the passenger side. You can see this is the passenger side looking in towards that little window right there. And what we're gonna have to do is rotate the crankshaft to get the bolts in view of that window to remove the 4 bolts that hold the actual torque converter to the flywheel. So that was probably one of the more difficult things, but it was doable. I was able to do it. So I'm going to show you kind of how I removed those bolts. And right there you can see is the front of the engine right here, and there's the crankshaft, and there's the alternator right there. You can see the belts and stuff. So now what I'm going to do is grab a 19 millimeter ratchet and place it right on to the crankshaft itself, onto that bolt. And we're going to rotate that in a clockwise position. Don't ever rotate this in a counterclockwise position, because this just doesn't run that way. The engine spins clockwise. So we want to make sure you spin it clockwise at all times. And so what I'm going to be doing now is ratcheting it very slowly. It's a little tough, but not too bad. And you're going to spin the crankshaft until we can get one of the torque converter bolts into view. So unfortunately, I couldn't actually get one of these bolts on camera for you, because it's just really hard to light it. And even with a GoPro, I don't think I could have lit it up correctly. So you can see I have a headset on and a floodlight, and I'm trying to get one of these bolts into view here as I'm spinning the crankshaft. And finally, I was able to get one to rotate up to right around the middle of that little window. And once you get that bolt centered in the middle of that window, then you're ready to go ahead and break it loose. So to break these bolts loose, I used an extended to 14mm socket, as you can see right here. And I think I'm using I'm using a 3/8 inch ratchet at this point. I was able to get that in there. It's got a little more, torque than a small 1/4 inch ratchet there. And basically you're gonna be using two hands here. One hand, you're gonna be using it to actually find the bolt and kind of center it onto the bolt, and the other hand you can use to ratchet it off. So it's a two-handed operation here, and you just need to take your time. I couldn't find the bolt right off the bat, and it took me a little bit of fumbling around to actually get it seated on there correctly. Then I was able to break it loose, and the good news is these bolts are kind of short. So once you do break it loose, you don't have to ratchet it very much to get it out. So here's a little tip for removing these bolts. If you're having trouble getting your ratchet to line up with the bolt head, just spin the crankshaft just a little bit and move it around in that window until you find a spot where it's a little easier for you to get your ratchet on it. This is one of the more difficult parts of this transmission removal. Once you get past this, it does get a little bit easier. Okay, now that we've got the torque converter bolts out of the vehicle, we can go ahead and concentrate on the bell housing bolts that hold the transmission to the back of the engine. And I believe these are 14mm bolts at the very bottom. There's two of them, and I broke them loose and I just hand spun these out, as you can see. And it's not that difficult at all. And a special note here is that there is no Loctite on these bell housing bolts. Now, a lot of people recommend that you use Loctite when you install the bell housing bolts back in, but from the factory, Nissan did not use any Loctite on these bolts. And so I was able to hand spin these out once I broke them loose. Now, these two bolts actually do face towards the front of the engine, and most of the bolts are actually facing away from the engine. So at this point now, I'm just going to kind of show you with my new transmission where these bolts are actually located, and they're at the very bottom of the transmission here. So I've got it off camera, but I'm trying to screw it in here, and then I just decided to lay it down here. But what I've decided to do here is every time I remove a bolt from the bell housing, I'm going to actually place it on my new transmission so I know exactly where it goes and there's no mixing up the bolts for the transmission bell housing. So you can see here, I've already removed these two. Remember, we started off with these two on top, and I've placed these into the correct position. So I'm just going to go along as I remove each bolt. I'm going to slide it into my new transmission so I don't lose track of which bolt goes where. Or you could cut a piece of cardboard out and kind of make a diagram and do it that way if you want, whatever's easiest for you. Okay, next up, we're going to remove the starter, and we're on the passenger side. There's the header, and right below that is the starter, and there's a little metal bracket there you can see, and also an electrical connection to the starter. We'll have to remove that. Just unclip it. It slides right out. And then there's a bolt that holds that little bracket right there, right up where that little hook is to my light. The very tip of that hook right there, you can see that little, I think it's a 14mm, don't quote me on that one, but there's two of those 14s that hold the starter in, and they're pretty easy to get out once you disconnect the wiring. Okay, now that the starter's out of the way, I went ahead and switched over to the transmission lines that are attached to the automatic transmission. You can see they're already leaking a little bit, so this is going to get a little bit messy, but we've got to get these two lines out before we can go any further on the bell housing bolts. So I've released, there's three 10mm bolts that we have to release that are attached to the engine area. Right here's one of them. You can see I've already removed that one, and these little clamps hold both of the two lines together. And let's see, there's one right here by the oil cooler. There it is right there. I've already removed that one. We've got one more towards the front of the engine right here. Let's see if I can get a better shot right there. You can see that one, we need to remove that. Then we're going to disconnect those two clips that hold the hard lines to those rubber lines that attach to the radiator here. So now I'm going to go ahead and get my little ratchet in here and remove this last little bolt. And then that'll be all the bolts that hold the actual clamps to the engine bay area, and then we can release the two hard lines from the rubber lines. Now, I just wanted to remind you that there's going to be residual transmission fluid in all these lines. So as you remove these rubber lines off the hard lines, you're going to get quite a bit leaking out. So have a towel or something ready there to pick it up. And the same thing with the rubber lines being released from the radiator. There's quite a bit in the little radiator reservoir. So you might want to have a little pan or bowl there to catch all this transmission fluid. It's going to kind of go everywhere. So be prepared for that. And we do not have to remove the hard lines from the engine bay yet. As a matter of fact, I dropped my transmission before I pull those out, but I'm just going to show you a little trick that will make it easier to pull them out. You want to pull them out separately. And you can see right here, they're zip tied together. Where each one of these metal clips reside, there's a zip tie, so we have to cut the zip ties and then bend the metal clamp open and then slide the metal clamp off, and that'll allow those two to be separated. Once you get them separated, it's much easier to remove them from the engine bay area. They just won't easily slide out when they're combined together like this. So you're definitely going to have to break these two hard lines apart before we can remove them from the engine bay. But we'll go over this procedure in a little more detail after we get the transmission out of the car. Now that we've got those hard transmission lines out of the way, now you have plenty of room to go around the outer bell housing and remove all the rest of the bolts. It's pretty straightforward, so I didn't really show that. I am going to show this last bolt that's near the top on the passenger side. Now, to get access to that, you have to remove the dipstick. I didn't show that on film, but there's a couple 12 mil bolts holding the dipstick to the transmission. Unfortunately, they've used Loctite on those two bolts, so it takes quite a while to get those bolts out. And this is the part where I wish I would have removed my Motordyne arc pipes already, because it was really hard to get to those two bolts to remove the dipstick. If I didn't have those arc pipes in the way, it would have been super simple. But if you have catalytic converters there, I'm sure it'll be a little difficult as well. That's why I'm recommending that you remove your catalytic converters or your straight pipes or your Motordyne arc pipes, wherever you're running, because it just makes it a lot easier to get to things like the dipstick bolts. But anyway, I was able to get them out and then get the dipstick out of the way. And now you can see I've got an extension here, and I finally got clear access to this last bolt on the bell housing. And it was pretty tough to get out, so I had to add some leverage. So I stuck a pipe over my breaker bar here, and then I was able to get enough leverage to go ahead and break this last bell housing bolt loose. So then we're ready now to move on to the transmission brace, and that'll be coming up next. Okay, before we break anything else loose, we need to go ahead and support the transmission. So if you're using a jack, or in my case, I'm using a transmission jack, I went ahead and placed it right underneath the flat part of this automatic transmission, the transmission fluid pan right here. And it's a perfect spot for this transmission jack. So I jacked it up and gave it just a little bit of up pressure. And then I placed the chain around the whole entire transmission for a little added safety measure here. And now we're ready to go ahead and release the 4 bolts that hold the actual brace that holds the rear of the transmission to the frame of the car. So just make sure that you got your transmission jack in place before you start this procedure. So now I'm going to go ahead and break these 4 bolts loose, and they're 14 millimeter bolts. And now once we get these broken loose, we're about ready to go ahead and lower the whole transmission down. So break these 4 bolts loose, and we're ready to do that. So once you get the transmission brace loose, you can go ahead and start to lower the transmission down just a little bit. We need to jar it loose from the engine actually. So you can see now I'm going to start lowering it just a little bit. We don't want to get too crazy and lower it too much. It'll put a lot of stress on the engine. But what we're going to do here is just lower it a little bit and start shaking the transmission. We need to start breaking it loose from the actual engine itself. At this point, you can see that the transmission jack actually started to slide a little bit. And so you got to be careful not to push your transmission jack right from underneath the transmission, because it will move a little bit while you're shaking all this. But I actually got to the point where I could see some light between the bell housing and the engine. So I got a large screwdriver here to kind of help separate it. Now you want to be very careful if you're using a flathead screwdriver or anything like that, because you don't want to mar up the mating surfaces of the transmission or the engine. So just be very careful. You don't want to use a lot of force course. You don't want to put any indentations on this seal. You want to seal up nice and tight when you put the new transmission in. So be careful when using anything like that. So as you can see right here, I finally got the transmission to separate from the engine, and I played around with it for quite a long time, shaking it and trying to move it, and my arms were just not strong enough. I finally realized I needed to get my legs into it. You know, your legs are a lot stronger than your arms. So I found a good spot right here on the oil pan part of the transmission. So I stuck my foot right here and just started pushing, and it slowly started to separate. Just make sure that if you do it this way, that you don't push your transmission right off of your transmission jack. So be careful not to do that, but that was the way I was able to separate it with my foot. Now at this point, we are free to lower the transmission down out of the car, and unfortunately my Motordyne arc pipes were starting to get in the way again. You know, I really wish I would have took these out earlier. Eventually I took them out before I put the new transmission in, but if you're running Motordyne arc pipes, I'm not really sure about your regular just Cadillac converters if they're going to get in the way, but I definitely had a problem trying to lower my transmission with those Motordyne arc pipes. You can see they're kind of getting hung up, and I had to keep moving my transmission around, trying to get around these things. So if you're running Motordyne arc pipes, you definitely want to remove those. It's just going to make your life a lot easier. You can see I'm just kind of slowly but surely trying to get around these pipes, and it takes a while, but eventually I'm able to get around them. So once I finally got my transmission free of the Motordyne arc pipes, I started to lower it down, and I heard something pop, and at this point I realized that I had forgot to actually release the electrical harness from the transmission. So make sure that you go ahead and release the electrical harness. I didn't show that because I forgot to do it, and it popped loose luckily, but it didn't damage anything, so I was very happy about that. And then there's one more little 10 mil bolt holding this part of the electrical harness right on top of your automatic transmission. It's attached to this whole bundle right here. So make sure that before you lower all the way down, you release this 10 millimeter bolt, and then now you're free to drop the transmission all the way down. Okay, so now I come around to the back, and you can see I lower it all the way down, and we've got a problem with clearance. As we talked about at the beginning of the video, you can see that if this is as low as it goes on the transmission jack, and now I'm going to go ahead and remove the chain, because now I'm going to actually just push this baby right off of the transmission jack itself. I'm going to kind of tilt it forward, and I'm just going to push it right off onto the cardboard. Now, as you're pushing your transmission off your jack, make sure you stay behind the transmission. You definitely don't want this thing to slide down and hit your arm or leg, so you don't want to be anywhere around the front of it while you're pushing it off. Make sure you do it from behind. And you can see now we've got just enough clearance. Since this thing is now on the cardboard, I was able to slide it right out from underneath the vehicle. And now we've got one of the hardest parts done. We've got the old automatic transmission out, so I'm pretty happy about that. Now all we have to do is remove the flywheel and the pilot bearing, and we are all done with the removal of the automatic transmission components. So now it's time to remove the flywheel, and you're going to need a little wrench in here to keep this thing from rotating while you break these bolts loose. So what I did was get a transmission bolt, bell housing bolt, and stick it right there, you can see. And then you could either use a torque converter bolt over here on the other end, or I actually got a bolt that was in my little, collection of loose bolts that would fit in there. I needed something a little bit longer than the torque converter bolt because those are kind of short. But I found one that would fit in there, and then you can see I've wedged a open-end wrench in here, and that just keeps it from spinning when you try to break these flywheel bolts loose. They've got quite a bit of torque to them, so you're going to need something to keep it from spinning while you're breaking these bolts loose. Now, as you start to break these flywheel bolts loose, make sure that your breaker bar is long enough. You can see I've added my jack handle to my breaker bar because it just wasn't enough as it was, and I needed a little more leverage here. And we talked about that earlier, that there was quite a bit of torque here, so make sure that you've got a big enough breaker bar here. Now that we've got the flywheel removed, now all we have left is this automatic transmission pilot bearing right here. It's stainless steel, looks completely different than the manual transmission, which is brass and much smaller, and it fits inside this crankshaft a lot deeper. This little thing is really hard to remove. I'd probably say that this was probably the hardest part until I figured out the correct tool to use to get it out. I spent several days trying to get this thing out, so we're gonna make this part of our next video because it's quite involved, and I'm going to show you everything I did to try to get it out before I figured out what to do. But this does come out, and this is the 0304 configuration. I'm not sure if the 5.6 looks a little bit different or the 0708 looks any different than that, but it does come out, and I'm going to show you everything I did to try to remove it, and then the specialty tool that I ended up using to get it out. So, you know, that'll be in part 2. You just need to stay tuned for that. Okay, I'm also going to be making a separate video for the rear main seal here. My rear main seal is definitely leaking here. You can see that shiny oil right there on the gasket, and a lot of the gasket makers missing here. And I've already wiped all the oil up, but it was definitely leaking right here. And so this has to be replaced, but it's quite involved. So it's gonna warrant its own video, and I'm going to show you a mistake I made and then how I fixed it. But yeah, we'll definitely do a separate video on that, so you have to stay tuned for that one as well. If you have a leaky rear main seal, hopefully you don't, and we can just go straight to the pilot bearing removal and then the reinstallation of the new 6-speed manual transmission. So stay tuned for all this, and we'll be back real soon with the second video in the series. So once again, make sure you catch the second video in the series. It'll be coming out soon. And until next time, you know what to do. Just keep on repairing.